Welcome to Leading People with me, Jerry Murray. This episode of Leading People is brought to you by Wide Circle, helping you make better talent decisions. To learn more, visit widecircle.eu. That's WIDECIRCLE.eu. Leading People is a podcast which features insightful conversations with leading people about leading people. Yes, that's a play on words. In each episode, you get tips from leading people such as CEOs, HR professionals, authors, and thought leaders on all aspects of leading people, including how to attract, engage, develop, and grow talent to build successful organizations. And we provide insights on how to lead yourself so you can consistently perform at your best. In this episode, I chat with systems thinking expert and the creator of SystemicIQ, Chris Soderquist, to learn why SystemicIQ is necessary for solving complex problems. What are the 6 skills of SystemicIQ and how to use them? He provides lots of practical examples and also advice on when and when not to use Systemic IQ. Chris Soderquist, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jerry. It's very nice to meet you and to be here.
Yeah, so this is really, we were introduced via some of the other guests on this program, and your name has been popping up in books that I've been reading. And so I thought, why not get an expert in the world of systems IQ to come on the show and explain this wonderful way of thinking to our listeners. However, before we get into that content, how did you get here? What was the starting point, the evolution of your journey? Were there some special epiphany or pivotal moments or aha moments where you went, oh, right, I need to go down that route, to get you to the stage where today you're an expert on what you call systemic IQ. So off you go.
Off I go. Well, not to paraphrase the the great band, the Grateful Dead, too much, but it's been a long, strange trip, right? When I think about it, I got into this field because I went off to college to look at how to apply mathematics to political science issues. And I came across a book called Groupthink, which just blew my mind. And it was all about how smart people can make really dumb decisions. And in particular, I was quite fascinated by the same group of people, almost the same group of people, who were responsible for the Bay of Pigs disaster, actually be able to make decisions around the Cuban Missile Crisis that really helped us to get through that here as service of the planet. So I was really interested in that idea of decision making and how to make sure that people could make the best decisions possible. And I was lucky enough in college to also have as a professor Reed Hasty, who is the co-author of a book called Wiser, which I can't recommend enough to your users. It's all about how groups can make really good decisions. He co-wrote it with Cass Sunstein and Reed Hasty. Book's called Wiser. But anyway, in working with him, I really learned and kind of focused in on sort of what are some of the underlying decision rules that make groups either work or not work. And it came down to when I started to go into working at organizations and trying to make some kind of an impact or change. I was a statistician for the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in Washington, D.C., and I was doing a statistical analysis of a new experimental error detection machine. And we figured out how effective that was. But in part of the process, I was actually noticing that there were a lot of defects that were coming from the same place upstream. And it was the fact that those defects were occurring that they actually could eliminate those first, and they wouldn't need this error detection machine. But they didn't really want to go after that particular upstream solution. So it really led me to think about, well, what are some of the reasons that people are focusing in more on downstream decision making, not thinking upstream? How do you really approach things from a fundamental basis? And more importantly, where is it that you can focus in on changing the culture to make that better decisions? And in doing so, in that exploration, I found the fifth discipline, and organizational learning and the application of systems thinking to solving problems really made sense. And it was that sort of confluence of that. And that was in the early 90s, I found that book. And then I started to work for a software company that actually created system dynamic simulation software, did some consulting and training. And I've been doing this work ever since. But it really was that sort of core concept of what does it take for a group of people to make the optimal decisions and not fall prey to unintended consequences, just poor decision making, again, like the Cuban Missile or like the Bay of Pigs fiasco.
Right. And that fifth discipline with Peter Senge became a famous book in the... Well, I mean, it was directed at this idea of learning organizations because he's a founder of the Society for Organizational Learning, isn't he? Yet you have evolved from that starting point into what you call systemic intelligence. What's the distinction that you make then between, let's say, because maybe some of our listeners have read The Fifth Discipline or similar books. What is the evolution that you've been following?
Yeah. I imagine that there are some folks out there that have read, either the Fifth Discipline or some other texts about systems thinking. And the main reason I adopted this, there was two main reasons for thinking about it and calling it systemic intelligence. First is it was a barrier to actually getting people to apply it. So I work a lot in the field of public health. I work in the field of education. I do a lot of work in the public space. And when I would say we need to do systems thinking, they would say, well, we're already working on the health system. We're already working on education system. Or even in organizations, we're already working on our processing systems or our production systems or whatever. We don't need systems thinking here. And it really is the case that you may think you're working on systems, but are you really doing it in a systemic fashion? Are you focusing on understanding sort of how the pieces of the puzzle really fit together and solving that type of a problem? And people often are not. So that was one thing. It was just a barrier to getting people to adopt the skills and practices. But further, as in working with Daniel Goleman and others, really started to think about this. This isn't systems thinking that you sort of just pull off the shelf when you need it. Really, it's a capacity for thinking about how to solve problems, whether or not you're working on any system at all. It could be, again, this ecosystem of, your marketing ecosystem you're trying to work on, fine. But it also might be, how do you better interact with your teenager? And all of those can be approached from a systemic capacity and really thinking about sort of the long-term implications of the decisions you're making. So it's a capacity that you can build. And I've worked with lots of organizations and individuals over time where we've started off sort of a lower level of systemic capacity, and through years of working together, built that capacity up so that they're better able to solve any new problems that come at them.
So for the layperson out there, and I'll sort of attempt to play this role, at the opposite side of what might be known as systems thinking, which is, of course, the underlying principles that drive systemic intelligence, you have this concept of like linear thinking, or just very, how would you put it, short-term, cause and effect in the same time and space type of approach. So to unpack this for our listeners here about what really is systemic IQ, and why is it so important in today's world? And could you introduce maybe some contrasts here between the way a typical problem is approached with traditional thinking let's call it traditional thinking that we're taught in school, versus how a systemic intelligence thinker would go about it?
Yes. Well, I mean, there's multiple things. So first of all, you'll know that you're in an organization that's probably low on systemic intelligence if it feels like that movie Groundhog Day, where it's the same thing over and over and over again. That's actually a great systemic movie, by the way, where he actually evolves his thinking throughout the course. But if every day you're kind of going in and you thought you solved the problem, then it comes back again and again, that's probably low systemic intelligence. You're probably seeing Band-Aids, or let's say firefighting, tyranny of the urgent. If you see those kinds of things, again, you're probably facing systemic challenges.
Stop me for a second. Just say that again, the tyranny of the urgent. Just give us the symptoms of that so people really can get the sense of what you're talking about.
Okay, so in working with production organization, it seems like every week there's like, oh my gosh, we've got these new orders coming in. We've got to like work overtime this week. Everybody drop everything. We've got this production line here we're normally running, but no, we got to put them on this other line and do other kinds of things. So everything is sort of managed by the urgent and in the here and now. It's usually a fire that needs to be put out right now, as opposed to basically thinning the brush and making sure that the brush is right, making sure that everything in the long term is set up so that the fires don't occur in the first place, which would not be tyranny of the urgent, right? That would actually be cultivating the forest to create the type of environment you want to live in.
So there might be a few cynics listening now saying, sure, Chris, come on. I have to go to work every day and all this stuff keeps happening to me. Come on. So let's help people break that cycle of the tyranny of the urgent, right? And in terms of systemic IQ, let's explain how they can start to think differently about the situations they find themselves in.
Okay. Well, to boil down and define systemic intelligence, it's really developing the most useful high leverage mental models for generating the results that you want to achieve. That's really what the capacity allows you to do. And a mental model is our theory of causal relationships that we use to think about, well, what's causing this issue? Where are there solutions for it? And how might I implement them? And I want to kind of boil that down to, in a very simplistic fashion, it's really making sure that you've got the right wall. In other words, you've framed the problem appropriately, that you have the right map of that wall. In other words, you know what the terrain is, how high it is, how thick it is, and all kinds of other things. So you have the map of it. You understand how that wall is formed and works, and then developing the right action to get over it or to climb that wall. So it's really the right wall, the right map, and then the right action. And really having the skills and capacities to do each of those things is what systemic intelligence allows you to do. And often in framing what's the right wall, we typically fall prey to events. What's the current event in the here and now? What's happening in front of my face? What's happening in my part of the organization? Rather than thinking about what's been happening in the organization over time, and how has that been relations between marketing and sales, production, supply chain management, the financial and the accounting departments? How are those all working together over time? So really, that's to getting the frame and making sure that you're expanding the boundaries right.
And you're playing with that metaphor. Who was it said? There was nothing. If you had the ladder up against the wrong wall, who is the famous person that said that?
Well, I don't know who the famous person was, but Joseph Campbell, I know, has said that. And he said there's nothing more frustrating than spending your life climbing the wall of success only to get to the end of it and find that you're on the right wall, the wrong wall, right? So you don't want to spend your time doing a really good job at climbing the wrong wall. That would be a complete waste of time, right?
And you were talking about the interrelationship between different, let's say, departments. And this concept of bottlenecks, for example, is a classic symptom as well of where there's an attempt to solve let's say, a bottleneck somewhere, and then all of a sudden it's like trying to catch a mole in the garden. It pops up somewhere else in the garden.
Yes. Well, I think that goes back to The Goal, right, by Elihu Goldratt. You're probably referring back to that. That's a really great book also, by the way, where you talk about how to identify bottlenecks in the system. But yes, it converts into what I would consider whack-a-mole management, when you're always just kind of focusing on a bottleneck here or there and not, again, thinking about how to reduce the waste along the entire process and how to really think about, again, eliminating upstream problems from even going downstream to create some of those bottlenecks. So really taking sort of that, how these different pieces fit together, and that would be all part of the right map, right? So first of all, we want to improve throughput. That's the right wall, perhaps. Then the right map would be, well, how is our system organized? And not only from a linear perspective, but how is it when we have bottlenecks here and there? What are some of the decisions that are impacted sort of more further away of field from that particular process? Like, how does that impact marketing and sales? How does it impact our customer base, et cetera? So really expanding the boundaries of mapping out how that system works, because unless you know how something works, there's no way you can identify the right solution.
Okay. So that brings us into some of the skills. Now, just for the benefit of our listeners, through our preparation for this conversation, I included you in a little conversation on LinkedIn about what was creating a scarcity of lorry drivers in the United Kingdom, partly related to Brexit. It was written by a lorry driver part-time journalist, and he listed all these particular issues, and you jumped in, and within, I guess, a short space of time, you mapped all this for anybody who wanted to understand the principles of systemic intelligence behind it. So there's skills that people can learn to do is to be able to develop this systemic intelligence. So perhaps let's explain some of the skills that people might need to adopt, or some of the skills that people like you have, which you could bring in even in the short term to teach people how to better do this systems thinking.
Yeah.
In the next part of the show, Chris explains the 6 key skills that you need to develop to improve your systemic IQ, and he provides lots of examples of how to use these.
That's a great question. So, first of all, again, if you kind of back up to we want the right wall, the right map, and then the right actions, there's really 6 skills that are required, at least from my point of view. And then each one of these can be dove into in more depth as needed. But the first is really an understanding that the goal is a useful mental model that has 2 components in it. What's the behavior I want to understand? And what's the structure that's responsible for generating the current behavior so that I know how to change it? So the first skill set is really linking structure to the behavior you want to understand. And all of the rest of the skills are really about how to do that. So another skill is expanding the field of vision. So typically we focus on the here and now, short time frames, short spatial dimensions. What I talk about by expanding the field of vision, it's really thinking about over longer periods of time and broader spatial implications. So when we mapped that out, the system around the driving in the UK, I really started to expand from just the driver's perspective to sort of thinking about how is this playing out over the long term and what is the different components of this. So expanding the field of vision is the second skill set. The third skill set, which I actually did in that, is building a shared picture. So often we have mental models that are very vague and abstract in our head. And what I encourage people to do is, to whatever means possible, is to actually draw it out, diagram it. What's the behaviors? What is the structure? What are the causal relationships? Share that with others, get their feedback, and to start working through improving that visual map of how the system works. So that's the third. The fourth, which is really important, and which I think it distinguishes systemic intelligence from a lot of other analytical approaches, is focusing on the physics. How does this really work? Not how are things correlated? I mean, you can actually get a lot of correlations that are just bizarre. Like, for example, the number of deaths by boating in the United States actually correlates to the number of Nicolas Cage films or something like that. That's just nuts, right? So what's the causal relationship or the physics? And that's mapping it out, in particular with stocks and flows, really maps out how that system works. The fifth skill set is to look for leverage. What's the actual leverage in the system? Where are people normally looking to solve it? And I got an interesting story on that at some point we can tell maybe. People look at, trying to solve problems in the same old place, the same old solutions, ping pong solutions. How do you actually look for in a new place where there might be leverage for making fundamental improvements? And then the final skill set is really an implementation skill set, which is around systemic orchestration. Often when people are solving problems and to try to do let's say a strategic plan and organization, they might have 4 or 5 key strategic initiatives, and they'll put, 25% of their effort into one, 25% of their effort into other ones, and kind of divide it. Rather than thinking about, maybe we want to focus most of our effort on this particular initiative for this year, and then the next year, another one, and then after that, maybe a couple other ones. So how do we actually unfold this in a way that implements effectively? And how do we embed learning into it? so that we're actually focusing on leading indicators as we go so that we can make sure that if things are going off course, we can correct our mental models and our strategies accordingly. So those are the key principles. Structure drives behavior, expand your field of vision, build a shared picture of the system you're trying to change, focus on the physics, seek leverage, and then systemic orchestration.
Okay, so we will unpack a few of those now because we've got plenty of time to do it. And if anybody's interested, just go to my my LinkedIn page and just look for recent conversations, and you'll see that Chris joined in and then got some other people to join in with this visualization that you did. And even better still, you've got this wonderful video on your website. I'll put the link to it, which was an award-winning video, and you explain the structure drives behavior very clearly at the beginning. Although, actually, I have stolen a little bit of this, I admit it, over the years, without maybe having the depth of knowledge, and that is that, often if we're in a building is not a bad example of structure driving behavior. If somebody needs to go to the toilet or whatever, or leave the building, there are ways you could do it, like open the window and jump out, or you could follow the structure of the building to help you get to the exits and things like that. Most people tend to get that, and then we see how our mental models drive our behavior, but then we see how organizational structures drive behaviors and organizational structures. I'm just trying to get this into the relative space of our listeners out there. So you said you're looking for leverage. You said you had a story you could tell us about looking for leverage.
Yeah, this is a story that folks may have heard already, but there's this story that a good friend of mine, Michael Goodman, tells a lot. He actually was the first person that came up with a lot of the systems archetypes. So he's been in the systems thinking for a long time. But he tells this story of, there's this fellow walking along the sidewalk, late at night, and he sees somebody that's, kind of crawling on the ground underneath a street lamp, kind of looking through the grass. And he asks him, "Hey, you look like you need some help. Can I help you?" And the guy's like, "Yeah, I lost my keys. Could you help me find them?" And the guy's like, "Sure." So he gets down on the ground next to him, starts crawling around. So the two of them are underneath the street lamp, looking around, can't find him. Finally, the guy's like, "Can you tell me about where you think you lost them here to help us to focus our effort?" And he says, "I didn't lose them over here. I lost them over there." And he points over there to a bush and to the dark. He's like, "Well, why are you looking over here?" "Well, there's lights over here. There's no light over there." And so we tend to only focus in on looking for solutions underneath where we've typically seen them or looked for them before. And by mapping out the system, you can actually expand your field of awareness and to start moving into these places where you don't normally look for solutions. And it's often in those strange places, those counterintuitive solutions, that's really where the high leverage is.
Yeah, and of course, another benefit of actually drawing this stuff is that when there's arguments going on about what's creating problems, that is often verbal. It's often between a couple of people. There's often a lot of, let's say, contaminated energy going back and forth where people, and it's like pouring fuel on a fire. And actually by just creating the diagram, you create what I've come to know as a third point, which is you direct attention. All that energy then goes from between the people trying to sort the problem towards the diagram. Can you unpack that a little bit? Give us some examples of maybe some situations where you found yourself being brought in and you're listening to what's going on. You're going, these guys really, this is not going to go anywhere. And you say, "Look, guys, let me get your attention over to a flip chart or a whiteboard."
Yeah.
Can you give us a couple of maybe some simple examples of where you've been able to throw some, let's say, move that light from the example you just gave and move the light over to where the keys actually fell on the ground?
Yeah. So the story that comes to mind first is actually one that a story of working with Craig Weber in the early days. So ages ago, I had been working with Craig at Boeing and was having some issues with my private school in the Upper Valley of the New England states. And we were having some problems with teachers and faculty and parents all having issues getting together. So we brought Craig in to teach them conversational capacity, which is, again, how do you get that sweet spot where you get people who are actually in a learning mode, right? That's where the sweet spot is. And I worked with some of the faculty. We worked with faculty, administration, and parents to map out the system, and we put it up on the wall. And you could immediately feel the tension in the room come down as they started to look at the map and say, oh, that's why we're having these. Oh, that's what's going on. Oh. And what a map does is that by actually putting something on the wall, and even though maps are always going to be wrong, they're always going to be incomplete, it starts to build this constructivist attitude across folks. And they move from pointing fingers at each other as being a problem to how do we work together to make sure that we've got the right map. And when you start doing that, and when we did that here, in this particular case with this school, they started to see how some of the ways that they were working together were actually sort of fighting against each other. And so they learned to think a little bit, again, more longer term and more understanding of how those components fit together. A similar situation occurred in an organization where they had spent a lot of time this was the IT department, so we did an IT systems analysis. And they were working on trying to figure out how do we keep our systems from going down. The IT systems, when they went down, would cause these bad experiences for people, right? So when you want to get on your computer and things aren't working, you get ticked off. And so they were trying to eliminate this sort of remembrance of a bad experience. And what to kind of boil that down is if you have a bad experience with a company, for the next week or two, you're going to be ticked off at them, right? 3 or 4 months later, you might not remember that. It might not be as emotionally raw. A year later, it might be gone, right? So their idea was, how do we make sure that the bathtub of remembering a bad experiences is low? And they were focusing on reducing the amount of time that a system was down. And on average, when a system went down, it was down for 20 to 30 minutes. And they had spent millions of dollars to move it to the 15 to 12 minute range. So it wasn't down quite so long. And we mapped this out and we said, okay, if you could, how far would you have to move it to really substantially eliminate this? They said, well, we'd have to move it down to 1 minute or 2 minutes. And they're like, I asked, so how much more time and effort would that be? Like, oh, that's impossible. So they kind of mapped it out. They looked at it. They thought, oh, that's not going to work. And then they were able to see that the complexity of the systems was actually contributing to it. So they could figure out, well, instead of worrying about bringing the system back up, how do we focus upstream and focus on all of the causes that cause the system to go down in the first place? And so they shifted their attention from sort of this fool's errand or hamster wheel, as Craig might call it, to a solution that was actually more fundamental, and they've started working on that.
Right. Well, I think that those are great examples for our listeners, because a lot of them are parents out there, or even if they weren't parents, they've all been to school, I hope. And so just being able to and then the IT one, I mean, many people find themselves in those type of meetings which are going nowhere, right? They're going round and round in circles. And by the way, listeners, if you haven't listened to my conversation with Craig Webber from a while back, please go do that now, conversational capacity, because it's a fascinating topic as well. A little plug for Craig's interview. Many people can probably identify with, and it actually what you do is quite a simple thing. You just get the attention, as you say, from pointing fingers at each other to pointing fingers at the map, and using all that energy and all that passion to improve the quality of the map. And then the hope is that you're going to find somebody's going to have that moment when they look and they say, there's a point on that map. I wonder what would happen if we changed that one thing. Would that reinforce or balance, or would that create this leverage that might get us out of this? So speak a little bit about how that works.
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to learn systems thinking from Barry Richmond, who is one of the luminaries of the field, went to MIT at the same time as Peter Senge, and developed the very first system dynamic simulation software package for the PC. So he was really big on applying systems thinking to everything. And one of the stories he would tell in workshops is about how he used mapping to deal with 2 teenage daughters who were having issues and conflicts. So one daughter was having some kind of a self-esteem problem, a little bit of anxiety issues. So he would spend time with her trying to work on and address those. Well, by spending time with her, he was actually making another daughter jealous. And so she, when he wasn't around, was actually picking on the other daughter. So you could see these sort of feedback loops. The more she picked on him, the more this other daughter needed some help. The more he spent time with her, the more jealous the other girl got, and the more likely she was to pick on him. So he actually mapped this out, put them down in front of it, put the map in front of them, and said, here's what's happening. And in particular, though, the girl that's jealous, look, I need to deal with this here, and here's how I'm doing it, and here's what's happening, and what can we do to alleviate some of this jealousy? And he came up with some solutions with her in terms of spending more time with her, getting her to do some things with friends, and other kinds of solutions. And so really, you could apply this methodology even in your family situation, but it was the mapping it out, seeing how the consequences of the actions of one person tends to generate consequences in another person, or in one part of the organization generates consequences in another part, et cetera. So mapping it out gives people that insight into, aha, that's what's happening, that's why it's ticking me off, and here's how I can get out of it or address it in a more effective way.
Okay, let's just keep unpacking some of this. What are some of the symptoms of poor systemic IQ, systemic intelligence that you see? We already start to touch on them. I mean, one thing that comes to mind for me is blame, right? A lot of people go and you hear it in the media all the time. So who's to blame for this, right? And I think a principle of systems thinking is when you look at how, and you ask the question how, you tend to have to run a process to figure out all the bits and how they work together. And then you start to see there might have been multiple actors. There's rarely one unique person in.
Right.
So can we give some other real examples of symptoms that you see that people fall for all the time, and it just locks them into a sort of vicious cycle in their thinking and in their behavior?
Yeah. Yes. So this is actually in the video that you pointed out, but it's an example that I think is fairly good at pointing out this idea of pointing fingers. There's a lot of pointing there going on, right? But typically folks are trying to address issues in the U.S. healthcare system in terms of the percentage of spending of GDP that's going towards the health system. And it's been rising exponentially for years, and it's continuing to rise. And, I work with legislators, and again, I've worked with Craig with legislators, and we do some training around this, and we ask them, who's to blame? Which is kind of like preceding it and kind of leading the witness, Your Honor, right? But, who's to blame? And, some of them will say it's those lawyers, we need to get rid of those lawyers going, chasing lawsuits. And, it's the big pharma companies who are milking people dry. Oh, it's those uninsured people over there who won't get a job and they're causing the problems. And they're blaming everybody else. And then when we map it out, you can actually see that the system is actually driving this behavior. If you've got people who are healthy and safe, over time they may become more likely to be at risk. And those at risk can develop chronic conditions. And it's those chronic conditions that are generating a lot of the health care and the costs. But people who are in chronic conditions, they want to live longer. That drives innovations and spending. That actually feeds back into R&D that actually causes them to live longer. And you get this sort of vicious cycle or reinforcing loop. It's really not anyone to blame in particular. It's more the structure of the system and the way, again, we focus downstream on solving problems as opposed to thinking more upstream. And once you map it out, and we get this with legislators, they're like, oh. And then we get, Republicans and Democrats in the U.S. at least focusing upstream. They might not have the same solution, but they start focusing in on environmental conditions, more personal responsibility up front if they're conservative, more environmental social safety nets if they're more on the progressive side. But at least they stop focusing their finger pointing at the end and they start thinking about upstream. And it's by mapping it out, and it's the physics, it's the structure that's driving the behavior. And if you don't have the clear picture of the structure, you can't identify the keys that are hidden under the bush.
Okay. Is it appropriate to ask you about the tragedy of the commons as a principle? Could people relate to that idea in day-to-day life?
Yeah, I'm not sure if folks can, but I mean, the tragedy of the commons is a famous story that comes from, using a resource up and the individual incentive is to use as much as possible. Whereas if everybody does that, you actually destroy the commons. And this comes from a story around the Boston Commons and having cows and having everybody bringing their cows in, and they basically overgraze the commons, and then nobody's cow gets any grazing. I've actually done some work with the University of Virginia, and they're working on the Chesapeake Bay system. And there's a tragedy of the commons that goes on there with the fisheries, particularly around crabs. And what happens is it's the incentive for every fisherman to go out there and to harvest as much as possible. And their incentives are to drive profitability. And what it does is they basically overharvest, and then it becomes more expensive, and eventually they catch fewer and fewer crabs, and they can go out of business. So a tragedy of the commons requires a rearticulation of the goal as someone or somehow managing that tragedy or that commons from above, creating the structure that keeps each individual incentivized to do the right thing. And this can happen with, natural resources. It's happening again with the planet in terms of climate change and issues associated with that. But it can also be around commons in terms of, access to somebody in an organization that tends to be the person or that resource that can actually help you get things done. If everybody's using it, then eventually nobody can use it because it either gets burned out, used up, and or you can't actually get enough to optimize.
Right. Okay. So we've done quite a bit on the symptoms. I hope our listeners are getting a sense of the types of issues where this systemic IQ can help. What are the benefits of high systemic IQ, both on a personal and an organizational? Have you got some examples from personal, maybe life, and organizational life?
Yeah. So, there's a famous example of Royal Dutch Shell in the 70s using computer simulation modeling and systems thinking to actually look at the global, oil industry. And they were you were able to develop scenarios around what the future might be. Under different futures, what would be the appropriate response? And it turns out that in typical response is to when there's a challenge or a situation like the embargo that happened, it's to centralize and to take and own everything internally into like one organizational unit instead of to decentralize. And by actually mapping out and modeling it and understanding it, they were able to do the right thing, which was to decentralize and moved from one of the lower rung of oil companies to one of the top ones. I worked with an organization around again, the same organization around the IT one that I talked about before, working on claims processing. And the typical response when the employees were developing stress and creating errors and slowing down the ability to process claims was to either penalize them or to hire more people. What happens by hiring more people is you actually burden the system, burden the mentors, and cause them to burn out, and then they leave. And then you actually have even more work with fewer people and fewer inexperienced people. So they were getting out of that cycle. So by mapping it out, they were able to move from thinking about, again, a quick fix, which is to hire more, to a longer-term fix, which was how do we develop and keep good mentors to manage the process of developing more experienced people in the process. I don't know if that helped to answer.
It does, and you reminded me there of the Wells Fargo case that I saw in one of your papers. And the other term that people are probably familiar with out there is unintended consequences. It's a favorite sort of get out of jail. Oh, we just didn't think that would happen type of statement. Is Wells Fargo worth explaining to people what happened a few years back around incentivizations? Because a lot of people might be listening to this who are on incentive programs, bonus programs, etc., and maybe can identify.
Yeah. So
Wells Fargo story.
Sorry about that. There's a lot to unpack in there, and there's a few things I think that might be relevant to your listeners. So first of all, one of the other persons that I studied with. So I was fortunate enough to work with Barry Richmond. I was also fortunate enough to work with Donella Meadows, who wrote the book Limits to Growth and has been responsible for a lot of systems thinking spreading in the world. She actually mentored Peter Senge and John Sturman and others. So anyway, I was very fortunate to work with all of them. She wrote a fabulous book called Leverage Points. Not a book, but it's an article you can get online. It's called Leverage Points, Places to Intervene in a System. And one of the higher leverage places to intervene is understanding what are the rewards and incentives in the system, because people will break the way the system is working in order to generate the rewards and incentives that they're given. And so what was happening in Wells Fargo is, hey, let's increase profitability. Wow, we've got these customers who are already customers and they have some accounts, but if we could get them to open up more accounts, we could make more money. And so what they did is they incentivized the staff to open up accounts with current customers. Sounds like a great plan, right? Well, what they were doing was they were actually opening up accounts without the knowledge of the current customers, because they were being rewarded every time they opened up an account. They would open up this new account, put some little bit of money in it, then they would get their little reward for doing that, and then they would close the account back. The current customer would be sort of unaware of that. This practice kept going on, and eventually, it became, people became aware of it. Customers got irate, and then Wells Fargo was basically fined for this, millions of dollars. So what was a short-term sort of solution or a strategy to incentivize people to open up these new accounts actually caused profitability to fall in the long run. And what systemic intelligence allows you to do, and why I can't stress enough, map out the system you're trying to change, is because most folks, their maps are just too narrow in time and space. We're either focusing again on the events and how things fit together and not thinking about it over longer terms, or when you map out how all the pieces fit together and causally play out over time, you can ask a question at each point on the map and say, oh, is there something that might occur if we do this? Oh, let's map that out. Oh, if there's something that might occur out here. And by mapping it out, you tend to find and create operational questions that help you to expand the map and make sure that you're you're more likely to see where there might be unintended consequences. And so mapping is the cure, or certainly one of the cures for unintended consequences, particularly negative unintended consequences. All actions have consequences, and most all of them will have unintended consequences. The question is, can you anticipate the most negative, awful unintended consequences and mitigate or prevent them? And that's where systems thinking can be very helpful.
So I'm going to do a devil's advocate on you here. I'll take the place of a listener and say, is there anywhere that systemic intelligence could not be applied?
In the final part of our conversation, Chris explains the difference between an adaptive challenge and a technical or routine problem. Many people misdiagnose problems, leading to lots of foolish initiatives that not only don't solve the problem, but often make it worse. Well,
I like to use the Heifetz sort of metaphor or thinking about issues similar to Craig Weber. So he calls Ron Heifetz, who wrote a book called Leadership Without Any Easy Answers, a great book, technical problems and adaptive challenges. And technical problems, Craig Weber has redefined as routine problems. And I like this definition better. Routine problems they're easy to diagnose. Everybody can say, yep, you've got your broken knee. People know exactly what to do. There's an expert to call, right? You go to the ER department and they're going to x-ray you, and they're going to bandage you up and put you in a cast and send you off with what to do. If the solution is a routine problem, there's a routine for dealing with it, systemic intelligence is really not all that helpful. You already know what the solution is. Why sit around and analyze it? I broke my knee. I should go do something about that. And there's an expert that can fix it. On the other end are adaptive challenges. And adaptive challenges are those challenges that are much more dealing with things like culture, right? Everybody knows what to do to prevent chronic conditions. It's basically to go after metabolic syndrome. So healthier people, more fitness, better nutrition, all that kind of stuff. We know what to do, but getting people to actually do that, getting an entire culture to shift, that's an adaptive challenge. And there's no expert. It's not, people can't even agree on what's the problem that's going on there, right? Is it those lazy people over there? Is it marketing and advertising? Is it, filter bubbles? What is the problem? So there's no expert, not easily diagnosed. And the people with the problem are the ones that need to learn about it. So again, if I've got a broken knee, I don't need to learn how to do an x-ray. The expert knows how to do that. If I'm part of a system that's actually needing to change in terms of the culture to move towards health and fitness, I need to learn with them. And so whenever there's sort of the more adaptive the challenge is, the more systemic intelligence is going to help you. It's going to help you to make sure that you've got the problem framed right wall. It's going to make sure that you've mapped out the issue collectively. Again, a shared mental model. Everybody in that should have this similar mental model if they're going to come up with a solution. And it's going to make sure that when you implement it, you're doing it in a way where people are learning as you go. Systemic intelligence, the more adaptive the challenge, the more you're going to need it. And I'm going to argue that as the world is changing, it's becoming more complex, right? And I would say that it's becoming more complex faster. In other words, the rate of complexifying is actually accelerating. We're going to need more and more systemic intelligence as we move forward, as we deal with COVID, climate change, all of these interrelated problems. They're going to get worse. Dealing with filter bubbles, global polarization that's actually leading towards authoritarianism, the march of authoritarianism linked with climate change, bad combo. We're going to need systemic intelligence to work on this.
Right. And one of the things that you've reminded me of here is how often an organization will look at an adaptive problem and throw a technical or routine solution to that problem. I mean, I'll give you an example from the world that I spend a lot of time in, the training, the world of people development. There's a seen as a problem, poor performance or something, or burnout. So what's the answer? Let's put them all in a training program. It's like, that's a simple thing. So training is, we need to train them. And yet it's just a very kind of remedial technical solution without actually saying, why do we have so many people who have these issues in this organization? How long has this been going on for? What are the trends over time? Can we identify some of the trigger points that might have set this off? How is, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of remarkable. That's something maybe our listeners can identify with is, you see an issue, you see something that's creating a problem, and somebody decides to just throw one of these technical solutions at it. And and in your heart and soul, it's not going to make any difference. So then it demotivates a lot of people in the system to bother doing anything about these things. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a couple of examples of that. So Atul Gawande wrote a book called The Checklist Manifesto several years ago in the United States, and basically said if physicians, particularly in the ER or whatever, followed these checklists, you would eliminate as much errors as possible, reduce costs, improve efficiencies, and everything would be great. Spent a lot of time writing this book on do A, B, C, and D, and E, and figured as soon as he was done with that was going to be great, right? Everybody's going to adopt it, and his work is done, right? What he found out was that there was not any adoption. The uptake to that was, minimal at best, because the physician community, that culture, they're much more of the Wild West cowboy types in the United States, right? Like, don't tell me what to do. I went to school to get training. I don't need no stinking checklist. I can do this myself. So he ran, the technical solution was, the routine problem fix was, here's the checklist. The issue is there's a culture that really needs to have an adaptive approach to dealing with it. I'm currently working with a large-scale, supply chain organization that's dealing in retail, and we're working on a climate mitigation policy tool. So I'm developing a strategy simulator for this organization. They're going to use it with their senior leadership to figure out how to more effectively address climate change, and particularly be good global stewards, and what's the policies that we need to do. We're actually going into conversations right now because they wanted to just take the tool and throw it out there and let people use it. And again, if you don't do that in a way where people are actually brought in, their mental models are surfaced, there's a conversation, we're like, oh, I was thinking this, but this is actually what happens. Well, why is that? Your model is screwed. No, wait a minute. Maybe my thinking is, unless you actually engage people in that sort of long-term elicitation of and improvement of their mental models, you're going to have that technical solution just rejected. It's not going to be any help at all.
And you mentioned I want to get towards the last little segment now. You mentioned the concept of leadership several times in the last 5 or 10 minutes, and this podcast is called Leading People. Interviews with leading people about leading people. What can leaders do to improve the systemic intelligence or IQ of their organizations?
So there's multiple things to do. So the first thing to do is to just become a voracious or an avid reader. So I mentioned already Donella Meadows in her book, Thinking in Systems, is currently the best book out there in terms of teaching this. It's still a little heavily computer science oriented in terms of some of the diagrams and the way it's taught. And it still has some of that MIT flavor in it, but it also has some really great chapters in there about how to think about working in systems, and in particular, those leverage points that I identified. Those leverage points, there's 12 of them, really handy for leadership to look at those leverage points and to discuss them. Are we actually fixing a buffer, which is really low leverage? Or are we working on the rules and the incentives in the system, which is higher leverage? Or are we working on our capacity to change our thinking, which is the highest leverage? So there's a whole bunch of tips in there that are very practical, and people can just start using and applying them. You want to start doing this and working on it in terms of, learning about it from issues. So rather than trying to just learn, you have to actually start applying it and sharing it with other people. So typically, I tell people, when you try to do this, don't just read the book. Get into the discussion group with others, start mapping things out, because you're going to learn together. And that's how I learned this. Prior to actually getting into the field, I got a study group together in the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in DC, and we developed our systems thinking capacity in weekly brown bag lunch sessions. So work with others. There's videos and resources on my website. Please sign up for those and look at those. And there's a blog that we're talking about right here, Jerry, that I'm going to start up in the next month, so it should be available. This blog will allow folks to actually select or actually propose, here are some systems topics or topics we think are systemic issues. How might we approach those? And so I'll pick one of those every few weeks and actually teach folks how to think about that. So it'll be a practical and applied thing. So really, make sure that you're focusing on, and when you're reading the news, just so this is the fourth tip, right? Just, okay, where is it, like this driver's issue that you just raised with the UK, where is it that this might be not thought of systemically? How might I think about that? How might I map that out? And just start trying to apply it every day, sort of like systems thinking in the news. So those are some ideas and tips that would work.
And the interactive blog, is you shared it with me a few days ago, where you kind of sort of, maybe it'd been in your mind for a while, but this little mapping you did on LinkedIn was a bit of a catalyst, I think. It sounds like a fantastic opportunity for people to actually get a first-hand experience of how powerful this whole approach can be. So I guess you'll specify a little bit, give some guidelines to people on how to submit something or post it. Mm-hmm. And I guess you'll invite other people who are into systemic IQ to contribute their thoughts. Maybe that's a way for everybody to pitch in and see, as you said yourself, get the first version of the map visualization out and see where other people can be invited to look at improving the map, identifying leverage points, etc. So that's something for our listeners to really look forward to. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the ordinary person out there who may not be running a business or that, but just in our ordinary day-to-day lives? Are there any little tips you could give people just in how we're approaching? That was a great example about Barry Richmond and the teenage daughters. Anybody who's got teenagers out there can probably identify with that. But any other little practical suggestions before we finish?
Yeah, so I've done some work with a group called Climate Interactive, and actually one of the things you posted on LinkedIn was around flooding, and we were focusing in on the impacts of climate and potential green infrastructure solutions to that. And green infrastructure is, rather than building more concrete, more culverts, is how do we use natural vegetation? How do we, maybe put vegetation on roofs or whatever? How do we use ground storage units, et cetera, in order to be more effective at it? And in working with them, we came up with this concept called multi-solving. So this is a very simple principle that anybody can get. And multi-solving is really, okay, I have a few different issues that are going on. What's one thing that we could do that might work on all of those? So, for example, one of the biggest multi-solving ones that I can think of is mindfulness, right? The more mindful you are, the more likely you are to be able to approach things systemically, the less stress you're going to have. It's going to have an impact on your health, et cetera, like that. So you can start thinking about like, okay, if I build this capacity, here's all the things it's going to address. Or, if your teenager is not doing what you want them to do and you're worried about their long-term goal, rather than punishing them or finding some ways to like focus on telling them, oh, you're great or whatever, build their capacity for self-reflection and self-efficacy. That's going to actually generate their desire to do things. They're going to have their more capacity. And again, they're going to be able to flourish more and more without you. So think about, what is it, just like health might be, focusing on fitness is going to solve a whole bunch of health issues associated with you, but it's also going to improve your focus on creativity and your ability to concentrate and your thinking, et cetera. So basically, if you're facing a few set of issues, just say, okay, what's one thing that if I did that might actually have a positive impact on all of these? How can I multi-solve here? And that's a general systems principle that doesn't require mapping it out necessarily, but you start thinking systemically by doing it.
Right. Well, there we have it, folks. Systemic intelligence in 45, 50 minutes, just over 50 minutes. And there's a lot more to discover. So we'll put links to your website, Chris, in the notes. I guess people can reach out to you on other platforms. Where else can they reach out to you? LinkedIn, I suppose, or other places? What's your favorite connecting point?
So my favorite connecting point is through LinkedIn. So feel free to look me up and join there, and we'll talk about that. I also have a Facebook page, but I kind of try to stay away from that. That's more involved with the filter bubbles, I think, which I'm finding really problematic these days. So that's probably the best place. And you can also follow me on Twitter, and I'll give you my Twitter link when you post this so folks can follow me there. Do follow me, because I am working on a book, which I think will be a sort of a companion or next level of Donella Meadows' book, which I just quoted. So feel free to keep following me for that, because that will be coming out, hopefully soon.
Very good. Well, I'd like to thank you for a fascinating conversation and for sharing all these wonderful insights and deep wisdom that you have with both me and our listeners. And I'd like to wish you lots of success with all the work you're doing, including that book, and I'll be one of the first ones to buy it. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Jerry. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. You will find details of what we covered in the show with links, etc. in the show notes. Please share your key takeaways from today's guest and let your friends and colleagues know about the podcast. Oh, and if there's a particular author or leading thinker you'd like me to interview, just get in touch and I'll do my best to get them on the show. This episode was brought to you by Wide Circle, helping you make better talent decisions. To learn more, visit widecircle.eu. That's WIDECIRCLE.eu. Until next time.